to see individuals that they have not been able to see for maybe quite some time. But more importantly, it has been a day of worship and praise unto our God. I'm still tossing over the idea of whether or not I want to continue with where we began last week, or if I want to take a look at 2 Peter chapter 2 tonight. And in fact, I believe with the direction that we were going to go tonight, that in all honesty, they can play hand in hand. One thing I do want to ask, is there anyone here tonight who was not here last week to get one of the outlines for tonight? To make sure everyone gets one. Now, we used these last week, and I made it, I don't know, I think point A under point 2, subpoint A, I think was as far as we made it last week. So tonight, what I'm going to do is begin with what you see under point 2, subpoint B, the wrath of God. Now, if you weren't here last week, just to really quickly give you an idea of what we're looking at, this emerging church idea that is becoming so prevalent among, of course, the denominations have been eating up with it for decades. And it's getting more and more and more and more so, but we're seeing these things creeping into the church. One of the things that the emerging church is going to teach differently than what the Bible teaches is in regard to the Judgment Day. Now, a lot of these folks are teaching that the Judgment Day is simply a day of reckoning. They're coming and approaching this with the idea of, well, maybe we have just misunderstood what judgment and justice and wrath actually mean. Maybe that's just going to be a day of cleansing in which God's going to come down to the earth and He's just going to take all the bad stuff away and replace everything with good, and everything's still going to be just like it is. I mean, we still have the same economical system that we have set up currently. It's just going to be good for everybody. And that's what Judgment Day is actually, in that mindset, is supposed to be. They've come to the point of saying the wrath of God cannot tell of a kind, merciful God, so we can't go that route. We've got to change what is being said there so that it comes in line with this let me feel good in what I'm doing idea. Now, last week we began taking a look at the biblical view of the Judgment Day and what to expect and what is coming. But we also noticed that in order to look at biblical judgment, you could not look at it without consideration of God's love. Because that's the determining factor behind judgment and how God's justice is going to be dealt out. Justice is going to be dealt out toward those that love God compared to those who do not. And in that, God's love is going to be shown toward all, in that His justice is righteous. And His judgment is righteous. We noticed that this morning as we were going through our lesson study together. But tonight, I want us to begin taking a look at the wrath of God. God's love, His justice, is twofold. There's a side of God's justice that is gracious. There's a side of God's justice that is merciful. But there is also a side of God's justice that, just as the Word declares, is just. It is right. Now, if you were to turn back to Isaiah 53 and notice the details given about Christ, His life, what He was to expect coming judgment, I find it interesting that so many of these people, including these emerging church folks, will go down the route of teaching that these premillennial ideas that when Christ came to the earth, He never expected to be rejected by the Jews. When right there in Isaiah 53, Isaiah declares that His own would reject Him. Who were His own? The Jews. Where was He born? Into Judaism. How was He born? Under the law. Remember Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son, made of a woman, made how? Under the law. He's being made under the law dictates that He was born into that Jewish economy and thereby had to follow those Jewish dictates. So what we see is, coming through Isaiah 53, is that we have a pointing to the sacrifice that Christ would make, and that at the end, when that sacrifice would be fulfilled, that something specific would happen. Notice verse 11, He shall see the labor of His soul and be satisfied. Who has a regular King James version? Anybody have just a King James? Read that verse 11 there, Ken.
He shall see of the travail of His soul and shall be satisfied. By His knowledge shall He mind righteous he shall bear their iniquity.
Now, a lot of folks have the idea that on the cross, God turned his back on that scene momentarily. I'm not going to split hairs with someone and try to say this is a fellowship issue. I'm not going to go that far. I think it's a matter of opinion on either side. Either side, if you look at it independently, can be taken to extremes which are not biblical. I understand that as well. But according to Isaiah 53 and verse 11, God had to view that. He had to see that scene. He had to witness that scene in order for his justice to be appeased. Now, what do I see? He shall see the labor of his soul. Now, is this saying he's going to see the labor of his own soul? No. It's talking about Christ on the cross and the Father in heaven viewing this scene. Matter of fact, back up to verse 10. Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Why would it please him? Why would it please him? Because that's what was just. Just as Paul would point out to those in Rome, in Romans chapters 4 and 5, that when Christ came, he came because sin was in the world. By one man sin entered the world, by one man sin was redeemed. Man was redeemed, washed clean of sin. So what we see here is, yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him. He has put him to grief. When you make his soul an offering for sin, he shall see his seed. He shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the travail of his soul, and then he shall be satisfied. Now, when we are taking a look at the wrath of God, let's begin by taking a look at a couple of Old Testament passages in regard to where God's wrath would be directed. Now, you have the notes there in front of you, so let's turn back to Exodus chapter 22 and begin there. In Exodus 22 and verse 22 is where we want to start. Actually, I want to back up to verse 18. You shall not permit any sorcerers to live. Folks, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty harsh judgment. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Let's understand this. We ain't talking about some fanciful imaginary movie of magic that you see on TV. That's not what's being discussed. Sorcerers then, and in fact, part of the wrath of God and where it is driven, why it is driven there, we will notice in just a few minutes as one of God's servants went this route. But when you're talking about sorcerers and sorcerers, witches, wizards, as what the Bible declares them to be, you're talking about people who would look to the stars to try to tell the future. You're talking about people who said they could talk to the dead so that someone who was in the grave could come back and tell you what the afterlife life was about. To give you what? To give you what? Warning? Isn't that what God's Word does? Why are people always asking God for more? Why? Why do individuals say the Holy Spirit has to physically indwell me to help me to understand the Scriptures? Why have we got to ask God for more than what He's already given? He gave us His Son. What more does He need to do? What more does He need to give for me to understand His Word? I have used to be a friend of mine, a preacher who's across the big lake. Kind of held a veil over some folks' eyes for a while on his belief systems toward the Holy Spirit. Came out at one point, in fact, in conversation that he and I had, that his belief system was that once someone finds the truth and obeys the truth, then the Holy Spirit has to help you understand the rest of it. Now, wait a minute. Call me a dunce, but I don't understand why the Holy Spirit has to help me after I'm obeyed. If I was smart enough to understand it before then, how come I'm all of a sudden not smart enough to understand it after then? Paul put it plain and clear in Ephesians 3 verse 4. Whereby when ye read. When you do what? Read. Whereby when the Holy Spirit comes in and helps you understand. No. Whereby when God miraculously lays it upon your heart that you'll no. Whereby when ye read, you may understand. So what do I know? I know God made me smart enough to be an intelligent person. And that with that intelligence, I can read what he left for me and understand his will for me, right? Right. That's what he determined. Now, what do we see? You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. That's just, we'll skip over the grossness of that. He who sacrifices to any god except to the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. Now, sorceress, idolatry, all of this has ties to one who is not God. Every bit of it. Now, if you want to know why God said put sorcerers to death, don't permit them to live, because it was drawing people away into idolatry. That's why. Now, who sacrifices to any god. Verse 21, you shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. I find it very interesting that God has always had, we might say, a soft spot for the widow and the fatherless. You ever wonder why? Folks, in that day and time, a widow would just about starve to death because she was not able to support herself without a husband beside her. Matter of fact, when you read through the book of Ruth, do you not find it interesting that when Ruth and Naomi came back into the land, that Ruth was out gleaning in the fields? You understand what gleaning in the fields was? You see, the Jews were told that when they would harvest their lands, he said, you don't go all the way and cut the corners completely out. You don't reach out and get every bulb off of the plant. You leave those, but who do you leave them for? The widows. So that they may go out, glean from them and live. God has always had a spot for the widows and the fatherless. And there has always been a desire to protect them. Matter of fact, in James 1 and verse 27, isn't that what James declared pure religion to be? To keep yourself unspotted from the world and to visit, not just go out and say, hey, how you doing? But to take care of the fatherless and the widow. That's what pure religion is. All right? Now, coming back, verse 22, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. And here's the conflict. If you afflict them in any way and they cry out at all to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot. Any of you ever worked with metal and getting it hot and trying to bend it, reshape it? My father-in-law enjoys watching these television shows about forging. You know, these guys working and forging and making knives and all sorts of. There's a really neat program. You kind of have to watch it with a deaf ear because there's some language in it. But nonetheless, there is a program about these guys that are challenged to make these knives. Each episode is about making a knife. And I'll tell you something, watching those guys take some of the scraps that they're assigned to do, we watched one episode with them and they had to take a handful of ball bearings and some lawnmower blades and take chunks of pieces and put it in this little cube and melt it all and weld it together and form a knife out of that. I'm going to tell you something, I find that interesting. That you can take something as hard as steel, put a little heat to it, and soften it to where you can pound it and cut through it like butter. Now you think about God's wrath. He said, against those my wrath will become hot. My mind goes to that flaming metal. That metal becoming so hot that it could literally burn itself. He said, if they cry out to me at all, I will hear it. Here's how far it goes. I'll kill you with a sword. And when I kill you, then guess what? Your own wives are going to be the widows. And your own children will be those who are fatherless. You mistreat them, guess what? I'm going to put yours in the same place. That's wrath. That's wrath. Now, let's go a little bit further. What else does God's wrath lean towards? While we're there in Exodus, let's turn over to chapter 32. Chapter 32. And notice verses 9 and 10. Now, what's going on here? Moses is up on the mountain. He's receiving the law. And while he's up there, the children of Israel did something that we spoke of this morning. They rose up to play. And when they rose up to play, what were they doing? They were busily involved in idolatrous worship and committing all sorts of atrocities in God's mind toward that idol. What was that idol? That golden calf. Remember Aaron said, break their golden rings out every year, give me all your gold, and let's melt it down. And they formed it into a calf, and Moses came down. What did Aaron say? Man, we threw that in the fire, boop, and the calf just popped out of it. Well, I guess if that actually had happened, that might have had some significance to it. That ain't what happened. And you know what? Guess what? It ain't going to happen. Never has, never did, never will. Matter of fact, it always blows my mind to think how when somebody would make one of these wooden idols, all of a sudden when they made that little doll and they finished sanding it and he had all his little... I got to watch my tongue here. If you've ever seen some of these idols, let's just say they have some enamored body parts. Okay? Why? Because that was the focus of idolatry. Sexual immorality was the focus of idolatry. And when you see these little idols, there are specific body parts which are supposed to be the point of focus upon them. Now, when someone would take one of these little wooden dolls and they would get it sanded and have it just looking just like they want it, they put it up on a shelf and all of a sudden that thing became a god. What about the sawdust that came off of that piece of wood? What about the rest of that tree? You mean to tell me that you're going to take part of deity and throw it in the fire to bake your bread? You mean to tell me that you're going to take part of deity and cut it into slabs and build your home? If that wood is deity, so is the rest of the wood out of which it came. Now, what is the focus? Notice chapter 32, verse 9 and 10. When these people did this, the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, that I may consume them. Now, you see this next sentence right here? This was a test for Moses. That's what this was. It was a test for Moses. What happened when Moses came down that mountain? Remember, as he was coming down that mountain, he could hear the party going on. He could hear it going on. He said, what is this noise? Matter of fact, didn't Joshua say, man, is there some kind of war going on, some victory? What did Moses say? There ain't no fight going on. People done rose up to play. That's what was going on. And when they came down, what did Moses do when he saw what they were doing? He took those two tablets that were written by God's own finger. This was Moses' anger. This was Moses' wrath. And he smashed them on the ground. He broke them to pieces. Now, wait a minute. You just took the instruction that God wrote with his own finger. The way I understand this, now Moses didn't see God by the face. There were different times in which he saw parts of God, wasn't there? There was a point in time which he saw him from behind. There was a point in time which he saw his different parts of his body, and it is prescribed that he saw the finger of God writing upon these stone tablets. And he was so angry that he smashed them on the ground. Now, what point would that put you in? Think about it. Put yourself in Moses' shoes. What if this question came to you? And I'll make of you a great nation. I will make of you a great nation. What would Moses reply? Lord, don't let your wrath wax hot against them. In fact, if you look at Paul's declaration about what occurred right here in 2 Corinthians, I can't believe the passage just slipped my mind. I think it's chapter 5, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, in which Paul said about 23,000 individuals died that day because of what occurred right there. God consumed them, put them to death. Now, what kind of things causes God's wrath to be brought against his people? Look with me, if you will, in 1 Samuel chapter 28. In 1 Samuel 28, and notice something here. You notice when we went to Exodus 22 a while ago, we backed up to verse 18 and begin there. In Exodus chapter 28, one of God's servants goes to one of those sorceresses. And he goes to the witch of Endor. You remember why he went to the witch of Endor? He wanted Samuel to come back and talk to him. You know what I find interesting? When that woman did her voodoo, hoodoo, whatever, and she waved her little hands and burned her incense in the air, and look, here's how this works. She burned something in the air to try to get him lit. All right? That's how sorcery works. If I can trick your mind into thinking this is true, you're going to believe it. And what's the easiest way to trick someone's mind? Take them out of their right mind. Brother, there are people who believe voodoo actually exists. But you know the reason they think it exists? Because a lot of times what they put in that fire that they're burning is meant to take you out of your right mind. Your sobriety has been removed. Therefore, these things which are trickery and charlatanism come to you as truth. Oh, I saw this anyway. As King Saul goes to the witch of Endor to try to consult with Samuel, all of a sudden Samuel shows up. And I find it so very interesting that witch of Endor saw Samuel and she about fell out. She had never seen it happen before. She wasn't expecting this to work. Then all of a sudden, it did. Now imagine that. Now look at verse 16. Then Samuel said, "Why do you ask me, seeing the Lord has departed from you and has become your enemy? And the Lord has done for himself as he spoke to me, for the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand, given it to your neighbor David, because you did not," what's that word there? What's that little four-letter word there? "Obey the voice of the Lord, nor execute his fierce wrath upon Amalek." In other words, God says, I gave you instruction, you didn't do it. Therefore, my wrath is coming against you. In 2 Kings 23, 26 and 27, you have a declaration of another reason of which would bring God's wrath. Now, Manasseh was a king over the southern kingdom, one of the last kings, one of the last few kings over the southern kingdom. And what did Manasseh do? Manasseh brought death and destruction against Judah. Why? Because he offered his sons in the fires of Moab. It was a shedding of innocent blood. Folks, the shedding of innocent blood brings God's wrath. Right? I need to remember these things. And matter of fact, if you notice in Romans chapter 1, the same thing that Paul was telling those in Rome. Now look, let's understand something. Why was the book of Romans written? We need to understand what was the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book, if you will correlate this with the activities going on in the book of Acts, you will come to find out that Paul was out among the brethren, gathering up a collection to take back and help those poor saints in Jerusalem. Why were they poor? Because they weren't Jews anymore. They had left the Jewish economy, and in leaving the Jewish economy, they lost their businesses. They lost their ability to obtain a lot of the things that they needed to sustain a daily life. That was how the Jewish economy worked. If you're a Jew, you got it made. You can conduct business, and all the Jews will come to your business, but when you leave Judaism, they ain't coming no more. They ain't coming no more. That was what would happen. That's why they were poor. They had left Judaism. Paul was out bringing his collection back. Now, was there still a sense of animosity between Jew and Gentile? Mm-hmm. Or was there a... Now, folks, understand something. This is in the early days of the church. But she was still young. Very, very, I guess you could say, impressionable in the eyes of many. For lack of a better way to say it at this point in time. But Paul was going out and collecting money from Gentiles to bring back and help Jews. Now, folks, what would have happened to the church had Paul brought those funds back to Jerusalem and those Jews said, that's Gentile money. That's Gentile money. You see, brethren, the purpose of the book of Romans was to show that now Jew and Gentile are one in Christ. To show there shouldn't be any refusal one to another, that we're all one in Christ. Matter of fact, that's exactly what he said in Galatians 3. There's neither Jew nor Greek, bond or free, male or female. You're all one in Christ Jesus. So what is going on here? Chapter 1, he goes after the Gentiles. And I can just see the Jews who were reading this saying, man, yeah, go Paul, you tell them Jews all about it. Until he gets what we have in chapter 2. And then the Jews will be getting their own hands slapped. Now, in chapter 1 and verse 18, notice with me that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against what?
All ungodliness.
How much ungodliness?
All.
What if I just want to dabble in a little bit of it?
All.
You sure I can't just dabble in a little bit and everything be okay?
All meaning all.
The wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Now notice what these particular ones do. They hold down the truth. They suppress it in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is made known in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. What's he saying? Gentiles, you should have been able to look around and see everything right, just like we should right now. The trees, the grass, the birds, the animals, the people, the stars in the heavens. You should have been able to see those things and know just merely by their existence that God is there, because they testify of him. Shame on you for not doing it. Chapter 2, he goes into the Gentiles. Gentiles, you have the law. You have an even less excuse than the Gentiles had, or the Jews rather. You have even less excuse than the Gentiles had. As the Jews, you had what God wanted you to do. You didn't do it anyway. And guess what? His wrath is revealed against you as well. Notice chapter 2, verse 5. When in accordance with your hardness and your impenitent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. Brother, I don't know about you, but that's something of which I do not want to take part in. If you notice with me chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. If our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unjust who inflicts wrath? Paul says, I'm speaking as a man. Certainly not. For then how will God judge the world? Rather, one thing that we do know is that the wrath of God is coming. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 9 and 10. Now, I got ahead of myself this morning when we were reading 2 Peter chapter 2. I had 2 Peter chapter 3 in my head. I read chapter 2 with everybody else, just like you did. But I had chapter 3 in my head, and I think because Stephanie and I had a pretty deep discussion about chapter 3 the other night, and it's some things that I want us to talk about. So we may put this aside for next week and look at 2 Peter chapter 3, because there's some very interesting things about chapters 2 and 3 that I would like us to observe before we move on past it. But if we notice chapter 3 and verse 10, there's a day coming in which the Lord will come as a thief in the night. The heavens, they'll pass away with a great noise. The elements, they will melt with fervent heat. Both the earth and the works that in them shall be burned up. Remember how many times God talked to his people about his wrath burning hot? Brother, I don't know if it can get any hotter than that. A heat so intense that the skies, the heavens as we see them, the earth as we stand upon it, the elements that are therein, all the way to the very core, will be burned up. Verse 11, therefore, since though these things will be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in holy conduct and godliness, looking for and hastening, in other words, hurrying it up, wishing it would come along faster, the coming of the day of God, because of which the heavens will be dissolved, being on fire, and the elements will melt with fervent heat. It blows my mind how many people will look at 2 Peter 3 and verse 10 and say, that's just figurative. Now wait just a minute. How can this be figurative when he just earlier is talking about Noah and the judgment that came against those people? There wasn't nothing figurative about that. That flood came, and we see evidence even today that flood was evident, that flood was real, that flood was global. We see those things even in evidence today. How can he go from talking about something literal to something figurative without at least something to separate it? No, that's a literal coming of the day of the Lord. That is a literal fire. That is a literal burning of the heavens and of the elements. So much so, he said it twice. He said it twice. I believe there is an intent there to call our attention to it, that we should desire that when the day of judgment comes, that the wrath of God will not wax hot against us. Brethren, if there's anyone here tonight who is in need for the prayers of this congregation, to put on Christ in baptism, or to ask for the prayers of this congregation for strength, for forgiveness, for encouragement, for whatever your need may be, we'd ask that you come now and stand.